Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to our service this morning on Father's Day and Juneteenth. I'm the Reverend William Levwood, the minister here at Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. My pronouns are he and him. As we begin our service, I invite you, if you're in person, to silence your phone. If you're at home, to close the other windows on your computer, to take a breath, and to center yourself for worship. Each week we acknowledge that we live on stolen land. Actually, we say unceded territory to acknowledge those who came before, but it's also true to call it stolen land. This Sunday we acknowledge also the stolen labor of stolen bodies, the bodies of human beings forced into bondage against their will. This Sunday we acknowledge that this is the wealth of America. The wealth of America is founded on stolen land and stolen labor. And as those who went to the Poor People's Campaign march bore witness to yesterday, this wealth is still not evenly or equally distributed. The land and the labor, you could say, are still being stolen. So we acknowledge this as we seek healing and the realization of justice, acknowledging that no one is free until all are free, until the land and the people are both joyfully free. May we remain committed to making that dream a reality.
And welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Judy Robison. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm happy to be your worship associate today. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. If you're new to Accotink, or you'd like to talk more about this church, please be sure to reach out to me, to our minister, Reverend Levwood, or to one of our greeters today. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour, online or in person, immediately after this service. We're so delighted that you decided to join us today. Welcome, everyone. So we have a story for the time for all ages, the story called Juneteenth for Maisie. It was written and illustrated by Floyd Cooper. Maisie wants to play outside, but it is too late. It's getting dark, Maisie. It's time to stay inside. Maisie wants a cookie, but it is time for bed. Not now, little one. It's too close to bedtime. Maisie wants to stay up late, but she is too little. Bedtime is the rule, sweet girl.
Why so grumpy, Sugar Bear? Asked Dad. I can't go where I want, have what I want, or do what I want, answers Maisie. Well, tomorrow you can have a celebration, says Dad. What are we celebrating? Asks Maisie.
We will celebrate the day your great-great-great-grandfather Mose crossed into liberty. The day will be celebrated by us and many more families on a day we call Juneteenth. Dad lifts up Maisie into his arms. I bet you're tired of hearing no all the time. Well, great-great-great-grandpa Mose heard no even more.
Grandpa Mose worked in fields that stretched all the way to sunset. He and the other enslaved people would be bone tired, but they had to keep going. Their enslavers wouldn't let them quit, but as they worked, they thought about freedom.
And before they finally went to sleep at night, they prayed about freedom and made plans for change and a better future. Some slaves ran north to freedom, following a bright star in the sky.
They sweat, they bled, and they cried till those cries were quieted by a single proclamation from a brave president. Grandpa Mose heard that proclamation read from the balcony of the hotel on that warm June day in Galveston, Texas.
Grandpa Mose heard nothing but cheers, saw nothing but happiness, and felt nothing but pride shared by all those around him. The cheers became dancing. The dancing became celebrating. It went on and on into the night.
Grandpa Mose and the others had found freedom. They continued to work, but this time they were paid for their hard work. So they worked, and they saved, and they never forgot the moment they heard, the moment that changed their lives forever.
But things weren't perfect. Black people still struggled to stand shoulder to shoulder with white people. They still weren't treated as equals. It wasn't easy, but they never gave up. And every year on Juneteenth, they remembered.
They marched for jobs. They lobbied for schools and the right to vote. They shouted for opportunity.
And every year on Juneteenth, they celebrated and remembered.
They learned and they grew.
They forgave.
They excelled and achieved. They became heroes.
Now, sweet Maisie, it's your turn to celebrate, just like great-great-great-grandpa Mose.
It's your turn, Maisie, to eat some barbecue and drink some strawberry pop.
It's your turn to celebrate.
And to remember.
On June 19th, 1865, soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, announcing the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery in the United States. It was more than 2 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Celebrated every year on June 19th, Juneteenth commemorates the announcement of the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of Black citizens throughout the United States. The reading today is called The Promise and the Practice, Black Joy, a reading from Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson. But she begins with these words from Barbara Holmes, used with the author's permission. And we begin with this. Joy unspeakable is not silent. It moans, hums, and bends to the rhythm of a dancing universe. For our free African ancestors, joy unspeakable is drum talk. For enslaved Africans during the Middle Passage, joy unspeakable is the surprise of living one more day. For Africans in bondage in the Americas, joy unspeakable is the moment of mystical encounter when God tiptoes into the hush arbor. Joy unspeakable is humming How I Got Over after swimming safely to the other shore of a swollen Ohio River when you know you can't swim. And Reverend Johnson continues with this.
UU Minister Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson was quoting there from Barbara A. Holmes's book, Unspeakable Joy, a book that's specifically about how the contemplative practices of the Black church have sustained Black people in America through suffering and survival. More than referring to a particular church or denomination, Barbara Holmes shares that this experience is collective and transhistorical. And Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson says, it's also a different expression of Black religion than I'm expected to exhibit as a Black woman. She shares that on more than one occasion, she's had a particular mode of Black worship projected onto her, the more charismatic modes that we're so familiar with: the shout, the stomp, the song. Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson shares that for her, that particular style of Black worship sometimes strikes her as a caricature of joy, a shallow stereotype. And she sees in it the expectation that more Black worship will bring more lively singing, more rhythmic clapping, more energetic worship, and also the anxiety that more Black worship will bring more lively singing, more rhythmic clapping, more energetic worship, the shout, the stomp, the song. But this caricature, this stereotype, she tells us, is a narrow sliver of the complexity and the richness of Black spirituality and Black worship. The modes of Black spirituality that are most powerful, nourishing, and nurturing to Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson aren't the stop, the shout, or the song. Instead, she thinks of the rock, the sway, the bend, the moan, the hum. She thinks of these things done in community, marveling that in the midst of sadness and sorrow, in the midst of feeling the effects of generations of trauma wrought by racism and white supremacy, human beings can still find joy with each other, are still finding joy in each other. I'll share more of Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson's words a little later, but I think that this lifting up of the complexity of Black spirituality, of Black contemplative practice, brings us into the space of acknowledging the journey that we're here to acknowledge this morning. As the Time for All Ages story told us, to celebrate and to remember, to look back at the hardships and the struggles that African Americans have been through in this country and the changes that have come about, and also to look forward to and commit to making changes that still need to happen. It was in 1865, on this day in 1865 in Galveston, Texas, that proclamation went out, 2.5 years after Abraham Lincoln said it on January 1st of 1863. And 1 year later, the first Juneteenth celebration happened in Galveston, Texas in 1866. But also in 1866, the Black codes were put into law, restricting the Black freedom that was only a few years old, and the KKK was founded in that same year of 1866. So always this celebration of Juneteenth is both a joy and an acknowledgement of pain, a celebration of how far we've come and a remembrance of how far we have to go. And for those of us who are white, or who Ta-Nehisi Coates says are called white, in some ways we have to acknowledge that Juneteenth is not ours to celebrate. Not yet anyway. That in celebrating it, or at least in observing Juneteenth, as in all moments of observing Blackness, of seeing Black joy in Black survival, the survival of those who, as Audre Lorde said, were never meant to survive. In our seeing, our observing, our witnessing, we must be careful not to colonize or caricaturize Blackness or Black joy in Black survival. To acknowledge that the Black joy, this joy unspeakable that Barbara A. Holmes speaks of, is various, diverse, multifaceted. It is the shout and the stomp and the ecstatic song, but it's always so much more than that. She calls it joy unspeakable, and I think when she says that, she is in a way pointing to the fact that it's unnameable. And in that sense, that this joy is an intimation and an imitation of godliness. By which I don't mean omnipotence, but I mean that spirit of life that can come alive within the human being. That diverse, multifaceted spirit of life that can rock and sway and moan and hum and shout. That spirit of life that even if we find ourselves in bondage or in the experience of oppression, that spirit of life, that dignity that cannot be stolen, that finds a way to joy. This is Black joy, the Black joy that saw freedom, the ancestors who saw freedom, the possibility of freedom, even the inevitability of freedom. As Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote about the arc of the moral universe being long but bending towards justice suggests that that justice is inevitable. But we see this even when the seeing is most impossible. We see this when the realization of that dream is still only partial, not yet fully realized, except realized in moments when the body speaks that joy unspeakable, moaning and humming and bending to the rhythm of a dancing universe. To quote those opening words from the prayer poem from Barbara A. Holmes. And this is what UU minister, the Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson, is talking about. Marveling that in the midst of sadness and sorrow, Black people have still been able to find joy with each other, are finding joy in each other. This, I believe, is the promise and the practice of Juneteenth. That there's a freedom that cannot be stolen. That this freedom is a promise and a practice, like the opening of our covenant together, as Unitarian Universalist says, our principles, that we affirm and promote. We affirm and promote. We promise and we practice. We promise and affirm that human worth and dignity is inviolate, is a birthright for all. And we acknowledge that all the ways that this isn't true, all the ways that Black lives don't matter. And so we engage in a practice. We engage in a promotion of these values, a practice of nurturing resilient community, surviving through that joy unspeakable. I want to share more of Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson's words. She says, I call it Black joy because I am Black, and it is the joy that I have been familiar with my whole life. It is a joy that I have learned from Black people. The joy created through our collective healing, our laying down of burdens to be picked up and shared by people, our community. A joy not in spite of suffering, not a mask put on to hide pain, not an armor to put on to push through the pain. This joy is an embrace, holding and soothing us in our suffering. This Black joy, she says, is created through our being together. This Black joy that reminds her that she is not alone and that trouble don't last always. It reminds her that she's held and carried forward by a power beyond what she can comprehend. Then she says this, she says, I call it Black joy, but I want to offer it to the extent that it is mine to offer to this faith. One of my gifts, she says, to our Unitarian Universalism is the suggestion that joy is ours, that we are the people who commit to justice, equity, and compassion, that we are the people who aspire to world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, that we are the people who affirm our interdependence with each other and the universe itself. She challenges Unitarian Universalism and us as Unitarian Universalists to claim joy. She says that Unitarian Universalist joy will require a different way of imagining ourselves and a different way of being with each other. She says claiming the possibility of a Unitarian Universalist joy requires making space for the surprise that Holmes describes. Do you remember that? The surprise of having one more day. Claiming the possibility of Unitarian Universalist joy requires slowing down to hear the talk of the drum, pausing to move to its rhythms. Unitarian Universalist joy requires opening to the possibility of mystical encounter. Unitarian Universalist joy requires embodying this faith differently than many of us are accustomed to. This is part of the continued journey of Juneteenth. For this faith, this predominantly white faith, we need to claim this joy in new ways. It's not about having diversity in our pews. It's about being in solidarity with Black bodies and Black lives. It's not a particular style of worship. It's a commitment to be held and carried forward by a power beyond what we can comprehend. A promise and a practice to enter into solidarity for Black survival and Black freedom, so that we can be one people, sharing the pain as well as the joy, the struggles as well as the triumphs, surviving together. On this Juneteenth, may we recommit, may we celebrate the freedoms that have been won, and may we commit ourselves to working for the justice and equity that still needs to be won. This is the promise and the practice of Juneteenth, which I want to say is our nation's true Independence Day, our true Freedom Day, a day we are still making and must make together. May it be so, and may we be among those who make it so.
I invite you now to join me in the community blessing with these words of David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity.
May we come and build a land. May we hear that voice calling to us, the voice of freedom, the voice of justice, the voice that tells us that trouble doesn't last always. May we come build a land, my people we seek.